Good morning, all. Thank you very much and welcome to our webinar. Today, Reconceptualizing Trading Relationships in the African Continent Post-Covid19. The webinar has been very thankfully promoted by FGV EAESP and the AfroChamber of Commerce. We're very thankful to have your presence to this very august event. We're also very thankful to have the presence of all our very distinguished panelists, institutional stakeholders, top academics, and very top business entrepreneurs spread across the African continent joining us this morning. We're very thankful for that. A brief note on the theme of the conference before I call on the President of AfroChamber of Commerce and the Associate Dean of FGV EAESP to give a welcome ceremony. The theme of the conference today is Reconceptualizing Trading Relationships in the African Continent post-COVID-19. Obviously, we're currently in the middle of a global pandemic, and there have been significant disruptions across the globe in terms of trade, in terms of entrepreneurial activities, and in terms of business relationships. However, the organizers of this conference, we have chosen to adopt an optimistic view, and we believe that the pandemic will be over. And so, following the end of the pandemic, we believe that it will be a very opportune time in the face of the attendant disruptions in global supply chains, in actual business relationships for new investors, to take a very well-deserved interest in the African continent. And so this is what we're here to do today. We're here to, like I've mentioned to a couple of colleagues, demystify or deconstruct the otherwise duality of the narrative on Africa as a choice place for investment, and at the same time, versus or in view of the traditional or mainstream narrative. So before we go into the conference itself, I would like to call now on Mr. Hugh Mokaje, the President of the AfroChamber of Commerce, to give a brief welcome to our panelists and to you, our distinguished guests today. Thank you, Hugh.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. This event is to share experience with special guests from my many backgrounds in African continent. I remember African Mandela taught, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. I truly believe in those words, and FGV is working hard to promote education with many people here in Brazil and in Africa, but we need more. I would like to congratulate the team of FGV 1 MBA, led by Professor George Carneiro, for their work in connecting our links in Africa, and the FGV expertise team to put together this webinar. My dear friend, Dr. Bob Enoff, for the initiative and hard work. Dr. Enoff is my friend and work with us here in the Afro-Brazilian Chamber of Commerce as international comparative law and business expert with PhD and law from University College Dublin, Ireland, and an LLM obtained with distinction from Newcastle University, United Kingdom. He is also an international presenter on the international business law and development, and currently completing Global Executive MBA degree at FGV EAESP Brazil, leading business school. He has been the brain behind the event. Nara Pires and Ricardo Arikawa for coordinating everything. As always, we are delighted that senior policymakers and international organizations are here with us to participate in this discussion with the selective audience that attend these events. What is AfroChamber about? AfroChamber, the Afro-Brazilian Chamber of Commerce, is providing since the 70s alternative for Brazilian companies to access African markets, where the focus of the world is right now as the next growth and investment frontier. But we know that we have several challenges post-pandemic. So we thank all the panelists for their special presence and for taking time to be present today. What AfroChamber wants to share with all participants about Africa? For the growing that we need in Africa, AfroChamber agrees closely and actively to promote actions for improvements of trade and economic relations with the countries as sister nations, as an attractive destinations for investment and tourism. The following sectors have been identified by the African market as high priority areas of cooperation: agriculture, education and human resource, urban planning and management, technology and technical assistance, trade, and industry in general. Brazil is a great player in agribusiness, and African countries can be the next supplier in the world because we have great extension of land, and with the Brazilian experience, we can do with environmental and social responsibility. We also believe in the power of small and medium companies, and we are preparing a program in partnership with institutions involved in international trade to run in the next years and contribute to the formation of joint venture and the establishment of African and Brazilian companies in the private sector. AfroChamber promotes and shares information about trade missions, briefings, market research, foreign trade statistics, business opportunities, and any other information of economic and commercial interest. Participation in trade fairs and missions, seminars, and in these difficult times like this, we are promoting webinars also. What is Africa today? With a population of 1.3 billion of people expected to rise to 3.5 billion in 2050, a rising middle class, rapid urbanization, and a great and young labor force, definitely it's time for Africa. Africa economy is growing well, higher than the global average. According to the African Development Bank, and we thank Dr. Rafael to be with us here, that growth is projected to rise to 3.9 in 2020 and 4.1 in 2021. Brazil can develop through institutions and companies a strong partnership with African countries. AfroChamber was created to support this approach. Welcome once again. I wish you fruitful webinar. In my African language, I was born in Angola and living here in Brazil more than 38 years. In my language, we salute you, Mushala Kembote, that means stay safe. Thank you very much, all.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It's an honor for FGV to welcome our distinguished panelists and our select audience. I am Professor Jorge Carneiro, Associate Dean at FGV, and the Academic Director of the One MBA, a Global Executive MBA program put together by FGV and 4 leading business schools in 4 regions of the world. Right? We still miss an African partner, right? And we'll soon, let's say, make up for that, because FGV is a very internationalized business schools. We have partnerships actually with many African universities, but the program that I coordinate here still does not have an African partner. As I said, I hope we will soon have one. We're working for that. Brazil and Africa have a lot in common, right? History and culture, right? Not to mention also the economies, which are based in a lot of, let's say, goods that the world will need most, food, right? But besides that, we also have technology, right? And the panelists here come from the business world, mostly they are entrepreneurs, right? They also represent the public policies. We have here the African Development Bank, right? And they also come from the academy, right? So we have different perspectives here, which will be very rich. So without further ado, right, I thank you again and our distinguished panelists, and pass the word on to our moderator, Dr. Bob Inoff, one of our researchers at FGV. Bob, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor George. Thank you very much, Hugh, for the very kind introduction and giving us the background of the event. Like I mentioned, FGV EAESP and the AfroChamber have been very crucial and very key in promoting this event. And so we're very thankful and appreciative of their efforts. The way we structured this event today is, as I mentioned earlier, is we've got very key policymakers, academics, and entrepreneurs across the African continent, which we hope to engage in the policy insight, in the research, and also in the experiences, and we hope that we share insights on these. And we hope very well that you, our audience, will make this a very participatory and interactive session, which is our key objective. So a brief introduction of our distinguished panelists today. We have Dr. Raphael Henry. Raphael is he's the Executive Board Director. He's from the African Development Bank. He's the Executive Board Director for Argentina, for Austria, for Brazil, for Japan, and Saudi Arabia. He's currently resident in Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, and so he can give us very from the ground insights on things the African Development Bank is doing or has been doing before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and hope to do after the pandemic to restore Africa to the path of recovery, growth, and hopefully prosperity. We also have Professor Adrian Seville. Professor Seville is from the University of Pretoria, the Gibbs Business School. He's a professor of economics and finance at the Gordon Institute Business Science School in University of Pretoria in South Africa. He's a keen advocate of the development that can be achieved through increased integration of Africa globally and within itself, and within the continent or within itself. And we hope he will be sharing, insights on his research with us today. Professor Seville is also the director of the African Market Institute, the Gibbs University, and Gibbs Business School at the University of Pretoria. Also, we have Ms. Ndidi Nweli. Ndidi is she's an alumnus of the Harvard Business School, and she's also the co-founder of Sahel Consulting. Additionally, she's a co-founder of Ace Foods. She has a consultancy career that spans a lot of years in different continents, and she's also director on the board of various Nigerian companies. Additionally, we have Mr. Shukri Tofi. Shukri is a vibrant entrepreneur. He's the co-founder of the Fortified Business Group. He's also affiliated with the Side Business School at Oxford University as an entrepreneurial expert. So he'll be sharing, his entrepreneurial insights with us today. I guess what I'm trying to highlight by introducing the panelists is the fact that we've got a very esteemed board of panelists today. And so we hope that our very welcome audience will take advantage of the caliber of panelists we have and engage them in questions as you deem fit. To kick the event going, to start the event or to kick the event off, I would like to ask Dr. Henry. Interestingly, the Economic Outlook Report for Africa released by the African Development Bank just came out yesterday. And one of the key factors that the bank highlighted was that Africa's road to recovery can be best framed as a partnership effort, partnership from the private sector, partnership from Friends of Africa, both locally and overseas, and also partnership from developmental institutions. Now, the African Development Bank is a core developmental institution in Africa, and the bank has been involved in developmental efforts before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and hopefully after the pandemic. As a matter of fact, I was very privileged to speak to Dr. Raphael last year at the AfroChamber of Commerce, and he shared a very beautiful talk on the efforts that the African Development Bank are currently having on the continent with respect to engendering development and strengthening Africans' resilience. So if Dr. Henry wouldn't mind, the floor is his to give us a bit of overview and insight on the efforts that the African Development Bank, had been having before the pandemic to strengthen Africans' resilience, to engender its trade readiness during the pandemic and hopefully after the pandemic. Thank you.
Bob, if I may, Mr. Ranieri, if I may just say 2 words before, right? Yeah. So we'd like to remind the attendees that they can post their questions there is right below the YouTube screen, there is an app called Slido, SLI.do. Just click that link and you can write your questions, and Bob will go through them with the panelists along the session, right? Of course, I would like to say that the questions and the opinions registered in this webinar they do not necessarily represent FGV's opinions or AfroChamber's opinions, right? They are let's say the participants' opinions, and we are free to give our opinions here and discuss them. And I would also like to say, and Bob, please go on with that 2 of our panelists cannot join us today, right? Because they are in Ethiopia, and there is at this moment an internet blackout, an internet outage in Ethiopia. So communications are cut. So 2 panelists cannot join us today, right? But we have 4 distinguished panelists. So over to Mr. Ranieri. Please, Dr. Ranieri, thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Let me start by first thanking and commending the AfroChamber and FGV for this initiative, which I think it's very constructive in the moment we're having now, because thinking about the post-COVID world is something we need to be doing now to really set up the African continent for a strong and successful recovery. So as Dr. Enofe requested, I will just briefly comment on the fact that, yes, yesterday, very opportunely, the African Development Bank released a supplement to its flagship report, which is released every year in the beginning of the year, which is the African Economic Outlook, which looks at the economic situation for the continent, the trends, the challenges, and the outlook for the coming years every year. It was released earlier this year in January, so it was before the outbreak of the pandemic. So yesterday, the bank's economics department released a supplement to that report, focused on the perceived impact so far of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that report assesses the main challenges, what were the main drivers of or main aspects that were the vulnerabilities that cause more or less impact in certain countries, and look at policy responses to respond to the pandemic now, and position the countries for a successful recovery. So I would encourage everyone to go to the bank's website, it's afdb.org, and you can see in the homepage there, you will easily find a link to the report. It has not only an overview for the continent, but you will see that in the back, it has one-pagers specific to each country in the continent. So that's also very insightful, very helpful for specific interests in certain countries. In terms of what the bank is doing to face the pandemic, basically every multilateral development institution had to rethink what they were doing. And what everyone has done is to repurpose the work program. So how the operations that were envisioned had to be reconsidered, and the resources needed to be diverted into what was urgent to respond to the crisis. So that's what the African Development Bank has done. And a lot of it has to do with helping both the public sector and the private sector to withstand the shocks that they're facing now. The whole package that the bank was able to put together adds up to $10 billion. And that amount is distributed in different types of operations. For the public sector, a key destination of the resources is for budgetary support to really help the countries to be able to respond quickly to the extraordinary budgeted expenditures that they're having to have now, both for the medical response and also for providing social safety nets and supporting businesses. And on the private sector, you have support, you have resources directed to support businesses, particularly, especially those that the bank already had businesses with, to keep them afloat throughout the pandemic. And so in doing that, not only you preserve the business itself, but you preserve the jobs, and with that you can keep the economy running. And also an important part of it is also directed to trade finance, to keep trade going inside the continent and with the rest of the world, to really be able to have the necessary products for the short-term response and to keep economies moving, so you have prospects for a stronger recovery.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raphael. That was a very great overview. In addition to that, it's also crucial to mention the fact that, and this is addressed at potential or desirous would-be entrepreneurs and investors in the African continent. The African Development Bank, in addition to what Dr. Raphael has mentioned, I know he took a very pandemic-centric approach in addressing the functions or the measures the African Development Bank has taken in Africa. But it's very crucial to mention the fact that prior to the pandemic, the African Development Bank has been massively involved in infrastructural upgrading and infrastructural reforms, supporting infrastructural reforms across the African continent, to promote the vibrancy of trading relationships and investment possibilities in the African continent. So while Dr. Raphael Henry might have focused on the pandemic, the pandemic efforts, the bank, might have been occasionally, it's very important to mention. And I'm very thankful, Dr. Raphael, for the views you've mentioned. I hope the members of the audience would have questions that might also allow you to shed more light on, the activities of the African Development Bank on the continent. So thank you very much for your views. Thank you very much for being here with us today. I think you mentioned, how the African Development Bank, is assisting, or aims to assist, trading activities on the continent to make sure that the effect of the pandemic does not result in a grinding to a halt of trading relationships and trading activities on the continent. I think one of our panelists here today, Ms. Nweli, she's a very distinguished social entrepreneur on the African continent. She's a social innovator. She's an entrepreneur. Amongst her list of accolades and achievements include she's a co-founder of the Sahel Consulting Group, and she's a co-founder of Ace Foods, a social enterprise which processes nutritious food made from the best of West African cereals, herbs, pulses, and spices. So she's very well involved in trade. So I wonder if Ms. Willie, you'll be able to share with us, what has been, your experience. So for example, I mentioned at the beginning of this conference that something that characterizes, the discussion of Africa, is a manifest duality of its discourse. We have, on the one hand, Africa is, perceived and from the mainstream perspective as somewhere, that is replete with an oversupply of humanitarian dysfunctionalities. But on the other hand, we have, entrepreneurs like yourself who have demystified, these challenges and have excelled across almost every front in the African continent. So we wonder if you can share what has been your experiences. Obviously there have been challenges, but also how you have navigated the challenges and how, potential or interested entrepreneurs, can also navigate possibly similar challenges in the African continent. You can take, you can also adopt a pandemic-centric view in terms of how the pandemic has affected trade and what is key to, mention, maybe how you've overcome the challenges you've encountered. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And congratulations to the team for organizing this. I was so excited when I was invited, primarily because I work in the food and agriculture landscape. And Brazil is an example that we often look to. During the pandemic, I've actually been engaging with a lot of people from Brazil around how we can build back better, because we're more united now as a world facing a pandemic and understanding that it's teaching us that we have to source locally. And we also have to build relationships. So as a food entrepreneur and as an entrepreneur in the agriculture sector, the COVID pandemic has really revealed the fragility of our food ecosystem, not just in Africa, but across the world. And we're seeing prices of food rising. We're also seeing disruptions in value chains, and we're understanding what we need to do to build back better. I just want to put forward a few ideas and hopefully address your question around how to succeed in this landscape. The first one is the importance of technology and innovation. When we look at our agri-sector, Africa has over 54 countries and counting, and we realize that we're naturally endowed for agricultural excellence, just like Brazil. We can grow almost everything. But what we haven't been able to do is improve the productivity and invest in processing and value addition. And so we are leveraging a lot of innovation and technology to see how we can leapfrog. We definitely look at the Embrapa example, and I would love to see a lot more collaboration between our universities and research institutions across the board, because there's so much knowledge transfer. Before this call, I was actually talking with a group focused on cassava and telling them that we use the SAH technology that we learned from Brazil. So there's a lot of opportunity for innovation and technology to leapfrog and to build back better, because our farmers have to be competitive and we have to ensure more productivity. Through our food company, what we do is process the best fruits and vegetables, the best spices, the best cereals, and we need to scale this up dramatically. So technology and innovation is one key opportunity, and there's a lot more we can do through the AfroChamber to ensure that this knowledge transfer continues to happen. And it's not just one way. Africa has so much to teach the rest of the world. We have value chains that we need to export to the rest of the world. Right now, ACE Foods exports to Germany and to South Africa and the Netherlands. We can do so much more between Latin America and Africa. The second key intervention area that I think we need to think through more systematically is education. And I'm so excited that we have a business school and a professor looking for Africa partners. I'm sure you can find a lot of great partners on the African continent, because we value education on the African continent. But one gap remains, which is agribusiness education, and really infusing this into every business school and ensuring that every agriculture school also has an agribusiness education. So I would love to talk with Giorgio and others to think through how we can really prepare a workforce for this sector that can unlock the agribusiness education. And then the third is collaborations, and that's why I jumped at the opportunity to serve. Market linkages are built on collaborations and networks. We have to learn more about each other. We have to celebrate what we have in common. We've started a portal called nourishingafrica.com. It's envisioned as a home for 1 million entrepreneurs on the African continent. It's a live portal. I encourage all of you to visit it. And we have data, we have financing, we have technology, we have knowledge. And what we would like is to see a lot more Brazilian entrepreneurs partnering with African entrepreneurs. You can search by country, you can search by value chain. Let's build these market linkages. Let's build these connections, not just to improve our economies, but to improve our SMEs, because SMEs are really the lifeblood of every economy. And we can come out from this COVID-19 stronger if we have the right knowledge, the skills, and the tools. The secret to my modest success has been the ability to reach out and to learn from others, and to really open my eyes to see what is going on in the rest of the world that I can replicate at home. And that's why we started Nourishing Africa, because we need this homegrown community across the board. And if I had one more second, I want to just talk about food. What we have in common with Brazilians is not just the culture, but also the great food. You know, in Nigeria, we consider a lot of Brazilian food our food because of the history of between our two countries. We have moi moi, we have akara, we have all this great food in common. And I challenge us to elevate the knowledge and the beauty of our food, just like the Japanese have done. Now, sushi is considered #1 in the world. We need to elevate knowledge about our food. It's healthy, it's dynamic, it has great history. And if we do that, we then ensure that there's more demand for our food globally, which not only ensures that our SMEs have more access to markets, but the spices, the flavors, the stories, it opens up a whole dimension of what we can be doing together. So I'd love to see what comes out of this. I definitely think that we could be doing so much more together. You can count on my support. Congratulations once again.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ndidi, for such a brilliant talk, for a very brilliant speech. She made some very valid points. I'm a food aficionado, so yes, indeed, Brazil and Africa shares a lot of food similarities and a lot of broader similarities, which we can leverage, to promote trading enterprises, to promote responsible investment on the African continent, and to promote other profitable investments. Now, talking about investments, something that has been very topical in recent times has been, integration of the African continent, most recently signaled, by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that was entered into force on the 30th of May last year. So there's a lot of talk on the potentiality of integration, in Africa and also outside of Africa, engendering growth, engendering positive development. Thankfully, we have on the panel today, Professor Adrian Seville. He's a professor of economics and finance, at the University of Pretoria, and the Gordon Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria. He's a professor of economics and finance. He's also, he has also been involved in very profitable investments across the African continent. And he's also, like myself, he's also interested in integration and the possibility of integration, occasioning and engendering positive developments, across the African continent. So I wonder if, Professor Adrian can, share his insights on maybe possibly what integration measures, might have existed prior to the pandemic, what measures are still continuing, during the pandemic, and what measures we hope to see on the African continent after the pandemic that can strengthen, the trade openness, or, the trading vibrancy of Africa in the first place, and also its openness and readiness to link, the rest of the world in terms of trade, investment, and business. So over to you, Professor Adrian Seville. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Bob. It's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me onto the webinar. For the better part of the last 10 years, I've been involved in this research, which interrogates what I'd argue are two big gaps in information or knowledge. The one is data gaps, that when we talk about Pan-African economies, one of the historic realities is very big gaps in information and data. All the way from the macroeconomic level, how's the economy doing, down to the microeconomic level, how are companies doing. And so that's one of the pieces of, or one of the aspects that our work has been able to address, is squaring up to information and knowledge gaps and voids. And I'll explain some of the ways in which we've done that in a moment. The second is, I would argue, the gap in knowledge that exists when it comes to integration. And invariably, or almost inevitably, when you put the term integration, or in a more politicized label, globalization, on the table, people immediately have a reaction, and it is fueled by sentiment rather than evidence. So, there's good reason for that, given Africa's tragic history with colonization. And so the responses are anchored in experiences which might be at odds with global evidence. And so about 10 years ago, we set out with this research to do two things. The one was to understand the potential impact and influence of economic integration. And maybe an easier word to use here would be connectedness. And perhaps I should say there's a third gap, and that is very often when economists talk about economic connectedness or economic integration, they tend to emphasize trade flows and capital flows. But what they are ignoring or overlooking is two other very substantial forms or channels of connectedness and integration, and that's connectedness through information, data, know-how, know-why, and integration connectedness through people, the movement of people across borders. So the framework that we build to measure connectedness has four pillars: trade, capital, information, and people. And trade is the movement of goods and services. Capital is everything from credit finance to foreign direct investment. Information is know-how, know-why, licenses, data. And then people reaches all the way from tourists to, well, can I say on this webinar, academics would count as the movement. Those different channels of TCIP, trade, capital, information, people, to measure the connectedness of countries, and then using a global data set, 160 countries, assess the relationship between that integration and the way in which economies and societies progress, and multifaceted aspects of that connectedness impact, from economic growth to
Okay, we seem to have lost Professor Saville. Hopefully, he will come back. We seem to be having a bit of internet connection with Professor Saville, so hopefully, he will come back. But during his talk, which I hope we'll be able to revert to,
these gaps in his work. And we were very fortunate to be given access.
Okay, so it's okay. I think Professor Saville will return back, when hopefully his internet access gets better. And because of, his very engaging talk, which was unfortunately interrupted, he mentioned, integration across different levels, across trade, across, individuals, and he's also mentioned, how things like, infrastructural renewal on the African continent can facilitate or engender further integration along these lines, which can strengthen, developmental projections of the African continent. And I have a kind of affinity towards how factors such as infrastructure, such as development of the relevant institutions, can engender for the development of the African continent. And I apologize, but I will go back to Dr. Raphael at this point. Just in terms of infrastructure, for example. So I think a key infrastructure that can facilitate Africa's development is broadband internet. Currently there's a wide disparity in terms of the availability of broadband on the African continent. And this can impact on entrepreneurial penetration, the development of new businesses. Broadband is one of several factors. During our last chat. The last chat we had, at AfroChamber of Commerce, he mentioned, Dr. Raphael, mentioned various, infrastructural reforms and various infrastructural initiatives the African Development Bank is contributing to. If he can just, Dr. Raphael, if he can just, shed a bit of light on that, and then we'll go back to Professor Adrian to, return back to the theme of integration he was mentioning, and maybe we can even draw similarities or draw, linkages, from the discussion Dr. Raphael is putting forward and Professor Adrian. before we then go to Mr. Shukri. Mr. Shukri, thank you so much for being there. I know you're there, and we would love to, hear from how, you have, also navigated, the challenges that exist from the lack of infrastructure, from the lack of, institutions, to advance your very well renowned success in the African continent. So first of all, Rafael, if you could just kindly, elaborate on, infrastructural and institutional contributions the AfDB has contributed to on the African continent, to improve its resilience for trade, entrepreneurial penetration, before we then go back to Professor Adrian Serville to talk further on the theme of integration. Thank you.
Yes, sure. The bank works so with infrastructure sectors in infrastructure projects in various sectors, both within and across countries. So projects that are within a certain country and also multinational projects. And those involve not simply roads, which is what we most simply think when we think about integration, roads and bridges. They're crucial, and the bank has been supporting a number of them. For example, recently we had just a little over a year ago, a bridge inaugurated over the Gambia River, which was the first connection between the northern and southern part of the country and the northern and southern part of Senegal. And that contributes to reducing a lot of distances and improves a lot the logistics in the whole area. So it's not only for one or two countries, but the whole region is benefiting from it. But there is also a lot of work, especially in energy infrastructure, that involves not only in generation and going into the renewables with a lot of support to hydro, solar, and wind power, but also in transmission lines. So you can have energy pools across countries, which enable both increasing access to energy and enhancing reliability of energy supply across in certain regions of the continent. Also, in terms of internet connect, in broadband connectivity, the bank has supported a backbone across the Sahel to promote connectivity in the whole region. So there is a wide range of projects that serve both countries individually and regions, and by extension the continent as a whole, that the bank supports and continues to support. So the fact that for now, for this year, there has been a reproposing of the work program for this year, it's the work program for this year. The projects that were already there supporting individual country or regional infrastructure connection in different sectors, they continue in place and they will continue to be implemented. And they have a fundamental role for setting up the recovery.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Rafael. Clearly, the African Development Bank is contributing to, the development of resilience on the African continent. And one of the ways it's doing this is through infrastructure to build or to enhance the integration within the continent, and also the ability of the African continent to integrate with the wider world. So, for example, in terms of broadband, like you've mentioned, within the continent, in terms of infrastructure, like bridges, like you mentioned. So this is very key roles that are being played or being orchestrated by the bank. So if we could kindly return to Professor Adrian Serville, he's an integration aficionado. If you could kindly, elaborate on the point he was making before we had the difficulties. Thank you.
Apologies, I'm back. The work that we set out to accomplish in terms of integration was to first fill data gaps, then to fill the evidence gap, the disconnect between emotional response and empirical reality. What does integration really mean for countries? And that's multifaceted, all the way from employment, to economic growth, to inequality and corporate performance. And then to also work on the data gaps, that we had access to microeconomic data, that we could blend with macroeconomic data. You need to be, I think in this webinar, we're speaking to the converted, so the point is easily made, but very often when people talk about Africa, the continent is regarded as a place, and the differences and variances across regions and countries is spectacular. So, to go to the earlier point that that you were making, how were we prepared coming into COVID-19? Well, the better part of the 10 years of data on assessing integration shows us that some countries were very poorly prepared and have made very little progress over the course of the time that we've been building this work. Other countries are better prepared, but have not moved. And South Africa is a great case in point, that when we go back to the start of the data series, beginning of the previous decade, South Africa was one of the most connected and integrated economies, but its connectedness and integration is overwhelmingly unmoved over the 10 years. And then other economies started off very low bases. And so, yes, there is a base effect. But if you're continually improving on a base effect, the base matters less and less and less. And there's something structural going on. And so the standout countries in West Africa, for instance, include the likes of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, really stand out as having made important gains and advances. In East Africa, I could sweepingly suggest the entire East African bloc really stands out, but Kenya, Rwanda have made substantial strides or gains in connectedness. And in Southern Africa, it is, we need to be a little bit more generous with our geography, but it's Mauritius that's made the biggest gains in connectedness. So, we use that then to be able to comment on who is structurally setting themselves up to participate in a world of win-win economics, recognizing that connectedness and integration, it doesn't guarantee that you land up in the right place, because we know that there are places where connectedness and integration have decimated country well-being, colonization, slavery, war. So we're after not just integration, but functional, inclusive, sustainable integration. And the countries that I've alluded to are the ones that really stand out in terms of the work that they're doing. Listening to Rafael's point about infrastructure, I think, and let me finish here, I think is a particularly important point, because historically, African economies have been set up as export-oriented economies, although it was commodities that they were exporting, and their connectedness to each other was particularly poor and weak. So there's a physical infrastructure element, and then there is the invisible infrastructure element, the intangible infrastructure element, which is the policy integration and coordination. And if we can get that into the right place, there are substantial gains to be had here. This last comment will be speculative more than anything, and perhaps hopefully speculative. And it's my suspicion from an investment perspective that what we're seeing a number of companies that we're invested in doing is turn away from China. With an anxiety about the concentration risk that outsourcing and offshoring has presented through the COVID pandemic. And in that same breath, Africa has the capacity to step in as a mitigator of that supply chain risk, and that many African economies, starting with the likes of South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, have the capacity to participate as manufacturing components in a supply chain where risk has been disaggregated, and supply chains are not always physical. They are increasingly intangible, and so you have the likes of South Africa, I'm saying it again, Africa's Silicon Savannah setting itself up as a potential contributor to supply chain through intangibles. So we think that there is a very real prospect of harnessing this integration and connectedness in a post-COVID world to translate into gains in well-being, prosperity, economic inclusion, country competitiveness.
Thank you so much, Professor Saville. Really appreciate the insights. If I could just mention for our guests that might just be joining in, Professor Saville has really highlighted points of integration in African health, for example, to quote him, how integration could really foster developmental prospects of the continent. Unfortunately, we originally had the Honorable Commissioner of the African Union, His Excellency Albert M. Buchanga, and the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, Secretariat, His Excellency Wamkele Mene. But however, given slight bits of political unrest in Ethiopia in the recent days and the internet disconnection that happened in the country, both of their excellencies had to kindly, decline participation in the event, given that they could not guarantee their attendance. So, I mean, the point, the reason I say this is because of the point Professor Saville has made about integration. I mean, they would have been perfect individuals to speak on the theme, However, looking at the occurrence through the lens of, the theme of this seminar, which is really, trying to spot the silver linings in storms, I think, the absence today could be the possibility for organizing another webinar with the excellencies to speak to these points, and hopefully we can have all of you distinguished members of the audience, also in such a seminar to, address the issues. Now, Mr. Shukri, if I could go to you really quickly. I mean, you've got a fantastic resume. You're an entrepreneur, you're a strategic advisor, you're an investor, you're a speaker, you're a film producer, and you're also the CEO of the Fortified Group. Clearly, that speaks to entrepreneurial excellence. That speaks to tenacity. That speaks to the ability to navigate, what we have earlier on termed as the duality of the discourse on Africa. It's a place of an oversupply of humanitarian challenges, but at the same time, it's a forum of extreme and desirable opportunities for investment. So, I mean, we would appreciate, if you could share what has been your developmental trajectory in achieving your successes in the face of, for example, the difficulties Professor Saville has highlighted, the challenges, but efforts, to address them that Dr. Raphael Hanari has mentioned, and also in the face of the plethora of opportunities that Dr. Ms. Ndidi Nweli had highlighted in her speech. So if you could kindly share your experiences, that we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm pleased to tell you that my anecdotal evidence, my sample of one and the people I've sort of done business with and come into contact with really mirrors the framework that Prof. Saville kind of put down. It's the first time I've heard of that, but the TCIP, some of the notes that I put down in terms of my experience with regard to doing business on the African continent mirrors kind of capital, information, skills and people, and kind of some of the issues around that. So Prof. Saville, your research is useful for me to kind of at least put my thoughts down in that respect. So I've had, just by way of introduction, I've done business feet on the ground in 17 African countries, and I've personally been to 11 African countries. And I think I'm gonna pull the plaster off, the Band-Aid off a little bit here and speak quite passionately around some of the real life stories that I have, having done business on the continent for the last 14 years. And so, I'm today invested in property and food and other businesses, but my predominant sort of business expertise and the predominant businesses that I've run have been in media, communications, and film. And I think the first thing that I want to say is that, when we speak about ease of business, right, I think we can quite easily just skirt over that and say, well, what's the ease of business? How quickly can you register a company? We think of great examples around the world and their alignment being in policies and the kind of rules and regulations that come with that. I can tell you that doing business and the level of interconnectedness is tough for an entrepreneur, and tough for small and medium enterprise businesses. And that goes down to like the logistical inefficiency, right? So around getting visas, moving people around, and some of the practicalities of actually being able to move between businesses. So in the years 4 or 5 years ago, when I was setting up businesses in Lagos and Nairobi at the time, just that ability to need to send my visa in, my passport in for a visa, those are real kind of on the ground challenges to be able to kind of get around in that respect. I know we have Dr. Ranieri on board as well. I think that I would be remiss to say that I think some of the financial products that we have domestically, for example, in each country, don't allow for the type of support required for small and medium enterprises. And that I can speak within a South African context as well. And again, I think for this audience, if we do have an audience from Brazil and South Africa, I think one of the saddest parts of our similarities is our Gini coefficient and the gap between the rich and the poor in Brazil and in South Africa. And so it's been spoken about often that we have financial products for the Switzerland part of Brazil or South Africa. And then we don't have financial products that are for the Bangladesh part of Brazil or South Africa, if you like, to kind of give it a kind of a global sort of example in that respect. And so they say, history is written by the conqueror. And I think that sadly, policies and decisions are made from within that first economy. And I think that the view and the sentiment and the experience of people in the excluded part of the economy don't often come into the policies and decisions that we make in and around ease of business, administration, bureaucracy, and some of the financial products that make sense to us sitting in the first economy, but really make it difficult for us to be able to bridge that divide. And so, mine is a sad story of doing business in the rest of Africa. I had to eventually shut down my business in Nigeria and shut down my businesses in Kenya because of the ease of being able to move money around and because of the difficulties and the ease of business in that respect. I can tell you stories where coming from Abidjan airport, I was walking with bags of money. In fact, I tell the story very often. And I'm sitting and I'm going like, geez, am I ever going to see my kids again? You know what I mean? Because I'm strapping money to my chest and kind of packing it in all different parts in my laptop bag and my take-on bag and my top pocket and everything else. Just because money gets blocked, we speak about double taxation agreements, the Mauritius kind of administrations have sort of assisted in regard and working through, kind of ease of banking and stuff like that. But the reality is that it's hard. And again, when you need to convert business into cash flow immediately, and you don't have those deep pockets to be able to survive, 6 months, 2 years, or whatever the case is, it makes it very difficult. I think another thing, and again, the fact that we lost one of our speakers while they were speaking speaks to the level of digitization in Africa as well, and to say, well, how are we using our competitive advantage, certainly in Africa, to say that we have, kind of language competitive advantages. We have a geographic and time zone competitive advantage to be able to connect to the gig economy and to be able to really drive that forward and to be involved in what I would call kind of productive activities. I think very often we speak about kind of consumption and copying of industries, and then we give ourselves a pat on the back, but are we actually being productive and breaking new ground in that regard? And so I think we need to hold ourselves as emerging markets to a higher regard in that regard, is to say, how are we connecting to the gig economy? What is our level of digitization? I think it's been spoken about quite a lot in this kind of COVID sort of pandemic time, that the digital divide has just kind of exacerbated the existing divide. And so if you are not connected, and your level of digitization was low, you would fall further behind in that regard. And so that's where it is. I think some of the positive things is the will and the sentiment of people to do business. So I think practically speaking, it's easier for me to catch a flight, get a visa, and move money to Europe, the Middle East, and North America, for example. But the sentiment and the desire to do business in Africa is one that is really, really, not only heartwarming, but that ability and the sort of like the kind of business cultures are, despite our differences and despite the kind of regional and language differences, I think that is something that is really, really heartwarming for me. And again, I would like us to see and take advantage of that move forward and remove some of those barriers for us to be able to do business. And so to say, how do you get a Shukri Tofi to come back and reinvest in Africa and say, is your next kind of business geographically opening up is the Middle East? How do you come back to be able to make that easier for someone like me in that regard? You know, I think we do come from a history that is you know, kind of stacked against us from an infrastructure perspective. So again, we know that the railway lines in Mozambique go from kind of not from north to south, and they don't really care about the internal integration of that country, but it's a purely extractive relationship. It goes from west to east, right? So that it can just, it's a purely extractive. And so some of those kind of aspects play out in a modern day contemporary economy as well, very, very clearly. And so I think the opportunities in my mind, right, is to say that in a post-COVID-19 world, certainly in a South African context, we've been speaking about a zero-based budgeting from a you know, kind of public finance and fiscal planning perspective, right? Zero-based budgeting. But I think in many businesses, it is a time that people are reimagining their budgets. They're reimagining their business models. And I think that is an opportunity for us to come in and say, if you're reimagining your budgets and rebasing your domestic budgets and your business budgets, what does that mean for African businesses and businesses in emerging markets to come in and play a role in those value chains and in those supply chains? Is this an opportunity for us to come in and say, we have a competitive advantage, we have a certain value proposition that we could sort of, you know, step in that regard? And so I'm very positive and bullish around where we can go going forward. And I think that sometimes it really is the smallest of things that trip us up. You know, and then it's not necessarily this big sweeping kind of policy changes that's required, but perhaps a minimum set of rules that allows people to be able to kind of, you know, move forward and do business with much more ease and efficacy going forward.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shukri. Fantastic presentation there. You know, really highlighting, you know, the fact that, you know, yes, there are challenges, but challenges bring opportunities, and opportunities can engender success. You know, one of the themes, like, you know, we've mentioned earlier, just to, you know, rehash the point for, you know, distinguished members of the audience that might just be joining us, is the fact that the COVID-19 global pandemic has occasioned a lot of global disruptions in supply chains, in previous existing business relationships, in investment opportunities, you know, but, you know, it also presents an opportunity. Because, you know, like in many cases, you know, the time of a crisis, a time for reflection, the time to develop resilience, the time to develop lean strategies. And we very much hope that, you know, the African continent would internalize, you know, the lessons to be learned from the pandemic, you know, and, you know, use this to come out on the other side of the crisis as a better continent, as a continent that is more receptive to trade, to investments, to business relationships. We've got a couple of questions from members of the audience, and I think it's apt that we take one or two of them. Mr. Shukri, just while I've got you, so I've got a question here that says, you know, Brazil and Africa, you know, share a lot of similarities. You know, how can we leverage these similarities, you know, to build up cooperations in sharing of innovation and technology amongst, you know, the private sector players, you know, to overcome some of the challenges you've mentioned, you know, and, you know, engender development in the both regions of the world?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things that I perhaps didn't hone in on as well a little bit is the skills development part, or the skills transfer part of doing business. And I'm going to rope in I think the opportunities for Brazil and South Africa as well. But, you know, again, I use Abidjan and Cote d'Ivoire as an example, because Dr. Ranieri is you know, living there at the moment. Is to say, we've come in there to do a big advertising media campaign. And the physical infrastructure, the physical capacity and resources were not there. And in the week or 2 weeks that we were in country to be able to launch on that, we built it. We literally got carpenters in, builders in to say, this is the equipment required to be able to execute on something like this. oh, and then by the way, we're going to leave someone behind for a week so that we can carry on building the studio setup so that you're able to kind of continue, you know, being able to deliver on this particular kind of scope of work. So, you know, I think there's a responsibility as business people to do more, to say that not only am I coming in to do business at that particular time, to do bilateral business, but to actually say, how do we make sure that those interactions last and that there's skills transfer at any given time? And that skills transfer can go in any direction at that particular moment. And then I think that there isn't, you know, last year I was at a UNESCO event where I interacted with many people from South America. So some people from Brazil, but also Colombia and things like that. And what struck me a little bit, we went out for dinner, and there is a language barrier here as well. And I think we can't take for granted just how big a barrier that can be at times, right? Is that we were as South Africans and as Kenyans and as Rwandans who were part of this group, our goal was to really get connected into the rest of Europe. That's the gold standard. If you have a product and a service and you can sell it to Europe where you have the kind of benefit of the kind of currency differential, that was our goal. And then we had people in South America that were just so fixated on the North American market. They were like, if I'm Colombian, I want to get into North America. If I can sell my products and services, that's what I want to do. And what we had discussed was that some of the news that happens in Colombia, Brazil, South Africa, they don't even appear on each other's newspapers. They don't even appear on each other's dashboards when looking at things going forward. And so I think we do have to create a dashboard of developing markets to be able to say, what are the learnings? What are the things happening? How can we, again, in a South African context, we know we have the BRICS, the BRICS grouping, again, which I think is quite exclusionary in a sense. In many instances, and maybe this is controversial, it probably should be called BRICA, you know, and maybe we should have kind of gone on board as a full-on continent and not only as South Africa. But the point is, how do we have more dialogue and conversations in that regard? Because we can teach people about inequality. We can teach people about, you know, the gap between the rich and the poor. We see developed markets with asymmetrical growth at the moment. We're seeing like a real problem with the type of capitalism that's espoused in the world. And so what can we as a Brazil and South Africa teach the world about where we're going and perhaps responsible business, the role of business in society? And so for me, I think there's huge opportunity. And I think the level of, I don't have the data on it, but in my mind, I feel like the level of integration is unnecessarily and particularly low at the moment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shukri. Great talk there, speaking on, you know, the need for integration amongst, you know, players in the global south, you know, to engender developments in the different regions in Latin America and Africa, you know, and how we should have, I like the point you made of, you know, having a developing countries dashboard. I too, because of my research and because of my, you know, training enterprise endeavors, I've come to realize, you know, this manifest dirt of trading efforts, of investment interactions, you know, between, you know, countries of the global south. And I think it is something we can really improve, you know, hopefully to be an offshoot of a seminar like this and other seminars that are being held across the world. And just to play more on the theme of integration, Professor, thankfully we have Professor Saville here, Adrian, who is, you know, an expert on integration, you know, in the African continent, on his efforts to integrate within itself and also, you know, globally with the world, you know, in the current of, within the stream of the current, you know, movement of globalization. And we have a question from the audience here that says, you know, how can we foster integration, you know, between Brazil and Africa to enhance the level of trade that currently goes on? Are there platforms or online marketplaces for business? You know, how can we foster this integration that Professor Saville talked about? The question is from Renato Pacheco Neto. So Professor Saville, if you could please shed some light on this. Thank you.
I think one of the key ingredients is for us to get out of our own way. That we have set up a range of obstacles. I think Shukri made reference to this in terms of the rules and regulations, and also about the absence of physical infrastructure. So I think we've got in our own way with lots of rules and regulations, a myriad of policies and different requirements, and that really makes doing business that much more difficult. And I would venture that those obstacles sit on both sides of the relationship, that this is not unique or specific to Africa. And then to work on the passage of goods, that there is a very ready manufacturing capability, not capacity, capability, resident in the Pan-African context. Also putting into my observation that Africa is not a place, and that the goods and services that Kenya can produce and exchange with Brazil are very, very different to the goods and services that Angola can produce and exchange with Brazil. There are some places where there is immediate connection available, and most obviously that immediate connection is through language. So I think, yeah, I'm just echoing Shukri's sentiments also, that one of the things that we find in our integration work is that if you want to be successful cross-border, one of your immediate competitive advantages is being able to speak the same language. So if you've got Portuguese on your side of the equation, and we've got Portuguese on our side of the equation, Angola, Mozambique, there you go. That's where you want to start. With that immediate connectedness, and you've pulled down one of the biggest barriers to connection, and then to look for the commonalities. And these commonalities have already been referred to, but just to re-emphasize them, I think that there's at least 3 commonalities. The first is in infrastructure, which has powerful spillovers, linkages, multipliers. If you get this right, the benefits will be felt for decades, even a century. You can think of the Hoover Dam of 100 years ago. The second is that agriculture is a very powerful competitive advantage, that we have a natural competitive advantage in both Africa, sweepingly, and Brazil, with agriculture as a competitive advantage. And I think the beauty, the elegance of agriculture is you can achieve viable enterprises without grand scale, that barriers to entry are much lower than many other industries, and that you can get onto supply chains. I think I'm overusing that term in this webinar, but you can find a point on a supply chain and work your way up, that it might initially involve raw agricultural product, and it eventually lands up in packaging and cold storage. The third is there are some evidences and experiences that parts of the African continent could gain from in learning from Brazil. And I keep making the point that it's very difficult to talk about Africa as a place, but one of the things that South Africa has headed down the avenue of under COVID-19 is something that starts to look like a universal basic income. And South Africa has been down this avenue for some years, but has got this very, very wrong. We haven't been able to redress our Gini coefficient and income inequality in the same way that Brazil has been able to do. And Brazil has had great success. I know it's not uncomplicated or uncontroversial, but great success with Bolsa Familias, for instance. And what can we learn from your experiences and practice and evidence in that we can apply in our setting? You don't have to invent the wheel. And that's what collaboration is about also.
Thank you so much, Professor Saville. Very interesting points raised there, really about how we can foster integration amongst the 2 regions, Africa with all of its multiplicities and differences, and Brazil. But I think something that your answer also threw up was the fact that a way that we will be able to get out of this pandemic is for 2 regions to recalibrate the failed supply chains. In a lot of cases, supply chains revolve around the activities of small and medium-sized enterprises. So we've got a question from the audience from, I think it's Cesario de Medeiros, who's alluded to the existence of difficulties in the ability of SMEs to do business in the region of, Brazil and in Brazil and in Africa, in the whole of Africa. Thankfully, we've also got a professor from FGV, Professor George Canero. He's a professor of strategy at FGV. So, Professor George, if you could kindly, answer this question. So, how do we address the difficulties for SMEs to do business in Brazil? First of all, and I think we'll swing over to the African point in a minute, but I strongly believe that, it's when we can recalibrate, field supply chains in both regions, we can talk about, integration and avenues for partnership. So how do you think we can address, for example, during the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic, shortly afterwards, and further on along the path, to prosperity in both regions? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Medeiros also. Doing business in Brazil is not easy, as we all know, right? Brazil stands among the last or the worst countries in the World Banking ranking of ease of doing business. And a lot of that has to do with the bureaucracy, right? In particular, for a smaller company, it's very difficult to cope with all the necessary requirements and license and regulations, right? Of course, Brazil has been fighting against this bureaucratic and complex administrative system for decades now. I even remember that about 30 years ago, there was a ministry of debureaucratization in Brazil. Unbelievable, right? And we have not done a good job around that. But as Professor Adrian said, Brazil has done a very good job in terms of taking people out of poverty. The Bolsa Familia, or the family income allowance, right, means not only money for poor families, it means that that money only goes to families who keep their children at school, who receive the visit of the family doctor regularly. So in terms of education, Brazil has improved a lot, and in terms of health also. So maybe Africa can also do that, because most of our problems are also African problems. And I like Professor Shukri's suggestion that instead of having the BRICS, where the S stands for South Africa, makes more sense to have the BRIC, right, acronym, where the A at the end would mean Africa. I mean, Africa as a continent resembles much more India, China, and Russia, and Brazil, for that matter, than South Africa, right? South Africa, although it is heterogeneous, the African continent is more heterogeneous. And Brazil, we are a very, let's say, we are a United Nations. Everybody feels Brazilian, right? But we have so many different regional contrasts that multinationals, when they come to Brazil, they find it very difficult to do business outside São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Belo Horizonte area, right? So that resembles Africa. And also, when Mr. Shukri said that the language is a barrier, well, in South America and Latin America, everybody but Brazil speaks English. Of course, there is the French Guyana also, that they speak French, Suriname that speaks Dutch, but all other countries speak Spanish, and Brazil speaks Portuguese. So all the other countries can understand one another, but they don't understand Portuguese. We understand Spanish. But it's amazing. I agree that Brazilians don't follow other countries, right? When I travel to teach or go to conferences in Latin America, everybody knows what's going on in Brazil. They ask me. I can hardly tell the names of the presidents of the other countries. It's a shame. So I guess that in Africa, it may be similar because languages are so different, right? At least here, we don't have such a big difference in languages. But Brazil has been closed to the world. Brazil is open to foreign investment. Actually, it's the fourth or fifth largest destination of foreign investment in the world, but we're closed to trade. So opening the trade with Africa would be a great opportunity, right? We have a lot to gain if we actually counterbalance the power of Western Europe, right, as former colonizer of Africa and Brazil, the declining power of the United States as leader of the world, and the rising power of China, right? We need some other balance here. And I guess that Brazil and Africa could mean this balance. right? We can start, of course, with commodities. Commodities are necessary for the world, right? Could be minerals, but basically food, right? And from that, we can add technology. We have great technological companies in Africa and in Brazil, right? So let's do business together. The two regions together, we wouldn't need so much, we wouldn't depend so much on China and the United States and Western Europe as Brazil depends today, right? Why not sell to the African consumers? Africa is the new frontier. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor George, for, the point of the need for, there to be increased trading activities, between Brazil and Africa. I'm a keen, I'm a key proponent of the fact too. I think, both countries can be definitely more actively involved in, building and establishing trading relationships amongst themselves, helping each other as both members of the Global South. Thankfully, we seem to have one member of the audience that also thinks in the same manner. So Shukri, if you could take one more question. The member of the audience asks, he or she asks, so can you please shed some light on what an SME Brazilian health technical company, can do to bring its technology to Africa? And I think this question is relevant for you because, like I'd mentioned earlier on before you gave your first presentation, that you've had an extensive array of entrepreneurial success in Africa in the areas of your ability to identify and grow some of the most exciting growth and business startups on the African continent. So yes, we know and we acknowledge that the fact of the multiplicities of reality that exists in the African continent. But if you give some insight on what an aspiring SME Brazilian health tech company can do to bring technology to Africa, we'd be grateful. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So thank you for the opportunity. Let me start with a disclaimer and say I think I'd need to know more about the health tech business to give sort of detailed advice in this regard. And so I stand to perhaps skirt over some important issues around that. I think when we think of change, any sort of change, and particularly structural change and change at a macro level, we have to think of the incentives and disincentives, right? Otherwise, if there's no discomfort and there's no need for change, there's no reason for people to kind of work hard to be able to move into that direction. And so I think we need to be asking ourselves, no matter what vantage point we're on at the moment, whether we're a business person, whether we're an academic, whether we are in a multinational organization, how do we try and lobby and perturbate the powers that be and the decision makers, and if indeed we are the decision makers, to create incentives and disincentives as was articulated about the Bolsa Familia in terms of the money that goes to families, right? And so that for me, that's a really good articulation of incentives and disincentives and how you incentivize to be able to hold up some of the other aspects of your social contract of being Brazilian in order for you to partake in that regard. I think with respect to an SMME coming into Africa, I think we've spoken a little bit about the potential, language barriers quite at length now. We've spoken about, the fact that, the kind of logistical aspects in terms of getting there. With a little bit of data that I would have is to say that I think that what would be amazing is to find a good partner on the ground, right? And to sort of maybe identify, opportunities in Africa and say perhaps, like Rwanda, for example, is potentially a ripe market that's kind of open and very technologically advanced. They're positioning themselves as the Singapore of Africa. Do you kind of set yourself up in a Kigali, find a partner there to be able to kind of launch into East Africa or launch into other parts of Africa? How do you find other kind of centers of excellence, perhaps in West Africa, in Accra, in Abidjan, to be able to kind of launch into those sort of aspects? I think what we can't do when coming into is to come in with this kind of like, arrogant view to say like, I'm coming in from whichever country you're coming in and saying, this is how I want it to be done. There are local nuances and local kind of, differences to each country that you go into. So I would say, find the right partner, find the right country, understand what you're looking for and how you add value to that particular market. But I do think there are opportunities for tech companies to come in. Health tech being one, I think it's genuinely a green field in terms of trying to look at that. And I think, again, COVID-19 in terms of has raised the awareness around health and tech products and our ability to kind of monitor ourselves and things like that. And then I think there's huge room again for fintech products as well, to find those right products that can really move us away from having again, I speak of the Switzerland financial system in the lived reality and the empirical data on the ground that is far from Switzerland in that regard for most SMMEs. So in short, pick your region, pick your country, kind of pick a market, find the right partners, and go in there and try and make it a collaborative effort as possible, you know. And again, I think as South Africans, for example, in an African continent, the most stories of South Africans, sadly, is this very arrogant approach when coming in, is this very sort of coming in, and as a South African, when you go into other parts of Africa, people have this knee-jerk reaction where they almost want to see you fail, by virtue of the arrogance shown by previous South African business people in those particular territories. So go in, open, listen, learn, enjoy. And I think that then the fundamentals of good business will come into play, irrespective of whether you have the world's best health tech product or not.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shukri, for such a great response to the question. I think one of the key points to reiterate is that, one of the basis of this seminar is to emphasize the fact that now currently, the world is going through a downturn. Africa has clearly not been spared from the ravaging impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. But however, we have chosen to adopt an optimistic view that this too will pass, and hopefully the continent will be restored back to the path of prosperity, to the path of trade, to the path of business investment and openness to business investment. However, we're currently in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that fact cannot be brushed away. So I would like to return back to Dr. Hafer Raneri. I apologize if you've mentioned this, in an earlier part of your talk, but it might just, benefit our, our audience, which being informed coming from Brazil, from Latin America, and from broader regions. What, for example, is the African Development Bank doing specifically to, aid the African continent in its path to recovery, after this pandemic? So, for example, what measures, what measures is the bank taking? Is the bank taking to, facilitate Africa's return to a path of recovery, afterward, and hopefully afterward prosperity? Thank you.
I couldn't get the whole thing, but what I understood is specific measures that the bank's taking for helping countries respond to the crisis. Is that it?
Yes.
Well, in addition to continuing the regular projects that were already ongoing, new approvals from this year aim specifically at providing governments with the resources they need to the extraordinary expenditures to support the health systems and to support social safety nets and businesses to stay afloat during the pandemic. At the same time, there are measures you have resources devoted to specifically to the private sector, really to keep the companies that are with stoppage in revenue, to enable them to continue afloat throughout the pandemic, and also measures to provide financial liquidity, trade finance liquidity specifically, and guarantees for international trade to enable imports of critical products such as food, drugs, and medical equipment for the short-term response, which is critical. And also to really keep in the short to middle term, keep economies running. You have, both from small to medium to large companies really being able to trade internationally. So you don't stop or you mitigate the extent to which trade relations are affected. And there is up to $1 billion devoted specific for trade finance. Then you also have the bank's teams providing advice, sectoral advice in every sector, basically, on demand to the countries and specifically to central governments on how they could best enact policies that are, serve short-term response and also set up a good pathway for the recovery. Related to that, I would just take the opportunity to mention then the issue that Professor Saville mentioned earlier in terms of the clarity that the pandemic brought about the vulnerability of global value chains and the need to think about regional value chains. This is something that the bank also really looks into and seeks advising countries in line with advice that the bank makes available in support of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area that goes in the line of building intra-Africa supply chains, which can increase intra-Africa trade, which is about 15% of the continent's total trade, which is lower than other regions. But with that, you also need other things. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area can help, and it can help both in the hard and soft infrastructure. It can help pushing regulatory reforms, and it can help pushing hard infrastructure projects forward. But at the same time, you do need to have prioritizing from the local governments. The African Continental Free Trade Area will be only as strong as its member countries. So there is a wide array of policy reforms that need to be undertaken that is up to the countries. And you have international institutions such as the Africa Development Bank that are here to support them in doing that. But they need to prioritize that and get onto it. And certainly they can benefit a lot from experiences and exchanges from other countries such as Brazil. And there is a great opportunity in doing that. And to the extent that they do that, then African countries will be able to serve both themselves, but also collectively the whole continent, their sub-regions and the whole continent. And with that, you have a better prospect for a post-COVID reality. Really, I think there is an opportunity into making the crisis a catalyst of reform. And that's something that the countries really have to seize this opportunity for a stronger and more successful post-COVID.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rannery. Thank you very much. Fantastic response there. Exactly, we have, in the course of this webinar, we've expressed the view that, hopefully this crisis would be, a catalyst, should play catalytic effect, in terms of engendering the much needed developmental reforms in governance, in institutions, in the management of resources on the African continent that can, support the continent, faster towards the path of recovery and possibly growth and increased prosperity after the crisis. Just to touch a bit more on that point, on the point of, governance and, much needed reforms, that can help, the African continent in terms of building its resilience during and even after this crisis. And Professor Saville, if I could just return back to you quickly, I can see, we're getting to the winding up part of the seminar. We've got a lot of questions. We're very thankful for a very interactive audience. But if we just return back to you quickly, could you maybe share, as an academic, what governance and reform measures you might currently be aware of that are currently being undertaken in the African continent to assuage, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also to ensure that the multi-level resilience is built as a result of the pandemic, and also that going forward after, the pandemic, we would have better structures in place. Like Dr. Maneri said, respective governments, respective institutions of the African continent will have taken the COVID-19 pandemic as a learning experience. So can you possibly share, what governance measures, institutional reform measures might currently be being taken on the African continent to, ensure these outcomes? Thank you.
Regrettably, I think very often governance is confused with paperwork and form filling. And that if I get you to fill in a whole bunch of forms and submit a batch of documents, whether physical or digital, then that represents governance. And there is a disconnect then between what I would call compliance, which is the form filling and the box ticking, and governance, which is the rigor of good management, good behaviors, good discipline. Interestingly, in the work done on ESG, there is a growing body of evidence that suggests that if you are going to get any one of those components right, emphasize the G and the others will follow. So I think that you are absolutely on the money to be highlighting the importance of governance. There are places in which governance has made some advances, but as a collective, the continent is off the global pace. And there are places where governance has gone backwards, and the country that has led the way in going backwards is South Africa. That there has been a huge slippage in governance in South Africa over the past decade under the Zuma administration, and it has left the country riddled with corporate malfeasance, audit mispractice, and that there is corruption that in many places is endemic. South Africa needs to show the way. So now I'm going to be political, perhaps, rather than pragmatic. If there is any country that is going to show the way in how you repair and remedy governance, it's South Africa. Because we have come from a place that was historically good. South Africa has a history of being strong in governance, world-class in auditing, strong minority shareholder protection, and so on. And a lot of that has been lost on the over the course of the last decade. So rather than pointing to any specific country, there's no specific country that stands out from my perspective right now that we're showing you how to improve governance. There's no one country in the African set that stands out. There are some that have made substantial strides in ease of doing business, which is different to governance. Rwanda and Kenya stand out on that score. But governance is an area where, as a collective, we've got work to do.
Thank you so much, Professor Saville. If I could just mention to our distinguished members of the audience, we get a lot of questions. If you can send in your questions to us, we'll be happy to get in touch with the members of the panel to, we cannot guarantee, but we hope that they'll be able to, give us with a bit of your time to resolve some of the questions you're forwarding. Now, we've got a question. I can see that we fastly getting to the end of the seminar. We're very thankful for our distinguished panel, members of the panel that have very kindly obliged us with their time. We're very thankful for the opportunity to have interacted with them. We're very thankful for the insights and the views that have been expressed during this webinar. We hope this will be one of many webinars that can foster and increase trading relationships between, Africa and Brazil, in view of, the cultural similarities in both regions share, geographic similarities, weather similarities. But I've got one question that I think is very important, in the spirit of trade promotion, which is one of the anchor themes of this event. And it's directed at the president of the AfroChamber of Commerce in Brazil. So the question says, how can Brazilian companies perhaps benefit from the AfroChamber's database and relationships in Africa to establish new businesses there? And so thankfully, we seem to be getting interests in the African country. We seem to be promoting trade relationships already. We hope this continues even after the conference. But Hugh, if you could please, shed some light on how companies in Brazil that are desirous on, trade in Africa, can take advantage, can leverage the resources of the AfroChamber in terms of, its database, in terms of its relationships, to build the necessary linkages and bridges in the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for the word. I think we are advanced in times of the hour. I thank you all the panelists for participating with us. And AfroChamber, as I told you, is the Afro-Brazilian Chamber of Commerce, and we have a lot of big, small and medium companies participating to make exportation and to make trade with African countries. But what we see, we are only in the radar of the countries who speak Portuguese, like Angola, for example. And South Africa is a great partner of Brazil. And I think that only the big companies are interested in to make this partnership with the parts in Africa, with the companies in Africa. Small and medium, we are creating a program for this year, because here in Brazil there is the many companies are medium and small companies, and we rearrange our approach for this company to put this company and a great package to trade with Africa. We can benefit with trade fairs, we can benefit know the markets in Africa. Recently, last year I was, for example, in Sudan. Was very interesting to be there. I saw a reality as I saw in Angola 20 years ago. And this gaps we are talking about is opportunity for all. So AfroChamber can help the companies to make it possible. This link with this webinar, we have now new friends and researchers in Africa. It will be a great platform. FGV also is working on it to share with more African students and to know about the reality here in Brazil and the great potential Brazil has to promote this approach with Africa. AfroChamber is here to help the people, to help the companies, because when we talk about companies, we are talking about people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hugh Murkaji, the president of the AfroChamber, for a very brilliant wrap-up to what has been a very fantastic event today. Personally, I'm very grateful to, first of all, the AfroChamber of Commerce, to FGV EAESP for promoting the event, and also to our very distinguished panel members. Unfortunately, one of our panelists had to leave a bit early. She had another webinar to attend. But I'm very thankful to all of our panel members who have shared their time, their experience, their insight, their research, to advance the course, to advance the theme of this conference, which has really been, all of us united by our love for our continent, Africa, and also united by our love to promote the potentials for development through investment linkages, through increased trade, through the dissemination of the relevant insights. So I'm very thankful, a very big thank you on behalf of the AfroChamber and on behalf of FGV. We say massive thank you to our members of the panel and also to our members of the audience who were very kindly obliged us with the time, and have also supplied us with very crucial and in certain cases, very interesting questions. We're very thankful, and we hope that in future we'll be able to come again on that forum like this, hopefully after the whole COVID-19 thing has passed away, or even before it passes, to also, share more insights into, to advance more knowledge in the matter. Very big thank you to all of our members of the panel and our members of the audience, to the AfroChamber of Commerce, from the AfroChamber of Commerce and from FGV EAESP. We say thank you and we're very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure to be here. And thanks to the audience, also to our great panelists. I learned a lot, right? And I hope to learn more.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all. Have a nice day. And we have a word in Africa called Ubuntu. I am because we are. So it's very important for us to stay together, and we depend each other. Thank you.